Thank you all for being with us for this Clerk of Session training. This is my first go-round of this work in Greater Atlanta. I've done it in a couple of other presbyteries, so this presentation is adapted from that. And there is a whole lot more experience of clerking in this Zoom meeting than I have. So I'm actually looking forward to learning from you all. So please do interrupt me. I'm making a note to myself, and hopefully it'll land on my to-do list pretty soon, to actually come back and edit this presentation sooner rather than later, so that I can make sure that the next version of it reflects well what I've learned today. So yes, please do interrupt me, ask good questions, and so we can go from there. So we've come out of a conversation with Buzz talking about being adventurous, and how the church is entering a new season of adventure. And deep down in my being, I know that that's true, but I also have to say the clerk of session is probably the least adventurous job in the church. Because so much of what we are called to do as clerks is to help ground the church in the past and to make sure that the future church has a grounding in who we were today. So anytime I start thinking about clerk of session training, I actually don't want to start with the basics of being a clerk, about how to keep minutes and records. I actually kind of look back into what it means to be Presbyterian. The first 3 to 4 chapters of the Book of Order, that Foundations of Presbyterian Polity section, is so important, and it's easy for us to miss it as clerks. So actually the first little bit of our conversation today is going to look at a couple of things in there that I hope you'll pay attention to. And when this is all done, I'll make sure you get a copy of the PowerPoint and some other resources. I've got a collection of resources that I will make available to you. So when we start thinking about the core principles of what it means to be Presbyterian, my brain goes to the 6 great ends of the church, which I suspect you are familiar with, but I don't think we can ever really spend too much time reminding ourselves of these. So the first of these is the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God, the maintenance of divine worship, the preservation of the truth, the promotion of social righteousness, and the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. Now, do any of these seem like a really important job for the clerk of session or the clerk of any of the councils of the church? Any of these that you are interested, that you would think of as your own, as something that you would be paying a particular attention to?
The preservation of the truth.
Yes. Yes. I think that's where that's where my brain goes when I start to think about what it means to be a clerk, is that we think about the preservation of the truth. I hope also that maybe we can expand it. We may not get to all 6 of these in our thinking about our work, but maybe we can also think about the clerk as being part of the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God. Because I think when we do our work well, we are building a space where God's people can live in really thoughtful, hopeful ways. So that's what so I hope we can think together about that today. There are also 2 sets of principles in these foundations of Presbyterian polity and in the beginning of the Book of Order that I think are really important for clerks of session to be thinking about. The first of these are the principles of church order. These are very old documents. They were created in 1788 by the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, and they were the basis for the First General Assembly in 1789. In your Book of Order, you can find these at F-3.01. The language here is dated and it's almost original. I'm not going to read every word of these for you because it is complex understanding, but I am going to quickly summarize what I think are the implications. Well, let me first say the most familiar of these for most folks is that God alone is Lord of the conscience. That's what one of the principles of church order is about. That's the one I've heard used the most commonly in my experience. And there are so those are and these principles of order have implications for how we order and govern ourselves. First of all, each of us ultimately answers to God alone. That is, that God alone is Lord of the conscience. The second is that we have freedom of religion. This is related to that understanding that God alone is Lord of the conscience. We don't have to be in relationship with the church, and the church doesn't have to be in relationship with us. The church can decide who is and who is in and who is out of its own life. We don't do this very often anymore, thanks be to God, but we maintain the authority to do that work because sometimes, unfortunately, we have to use it. The next implication of the principles of church order is that our faith and our belief have consequences for the way that we live in the church and in the broader world. We don't just believe and then not do. We believe so that we may do. Another thing that I think is really important in our work on sessions of the church is that we don't have to agree on everything. It is okay to have disagreement along the way. And the way we order ourselves is set up so that we can agree and disagree in constructive ways. Next up, it relates to some of our earlier conversation this morning. We are each called by God, and God places God's call on our lives. But when it comes to how we order and govern the church, the people are the ones who elect. Next up, our church powers are limited, and they can and they will be wrong. We can only do so much to control God's people and bring about change in God's world as the church. And somewhere along the way, we're going to mess it up. And related to that our authority as the church rests in spiritual things. So we live in two worlds. We live in the church world, the ecclesiastical world, and the civil world. And sometimes our work as clerks is responsible for bridging those two. So those are the implications of those principles of order. I hope you'll go read those sometime and think more about how these come up in your work as a clerk of session. But then I want to turn us to the principles of Presbyterian government, because these are even more important to our work as clerks. These date from 1797. And they were adapted, so they're 225 years old this year. This is the kind of basis of our understanding of Presbyterian governance. Over the years, they've been adapted and revised into the form that we now see at F-3.02 in the Book of Order. So I encourage you to read those, but I'm going to actually show you all of these because they're really important for how we do our work as clerks. First of all, that we are one church. The particular congregations of the Presbyterian Church USA, wherever they are, taken collectively, constitute one church called the church. Then we go to governance. This church shall be governed by presbyters, that is, ruling elders and teaching elders or ministers. Ruling elders are so named not because they lord it over the congregation, but because they are chosen by the congregation to discern and measure its fidelity to the word of God and to strengthen and nurture its faith and life. Teaching elders shall be committed in all their work to equipping the people of God for their ministry and witness. These people together are those who govern us. How does that governance happen? We come together. These presbyters shall come together in councils in regular gradation. These councils are sessions, presbyteries, synods, and the General Assembly. All councils of the church are united by the nature of the church and share with one another responsibilities, rights, and powers as provided in this Constitution, the Book of Order. This one, I think, is especially important. The councils are distinct, but have such mutual relations that the act of one of them is the act of the whole church, performed by it through the appropriate council. So when your session does something, you're acting and speaking and doing for the whole church. And finally, the larger part of the church, or a representation thereof, shall govern the smaller. This means ultimately we are a hierarchical church. We are connected to one another as we gather together, but the hierarchy is involved. Now, we are a representative system, but we are not. Presbyters are not simply to reflect the will of the people, but rather to seek together to find and represent the will of Christ. Those days when your session says, oh, we just need to go out and ask everybody what they think, and then we approve it. It can be helpful. That's a part of discernment, but ultimately that's not how we do this. We seek to and represent the will of Christ together. Decisions in our councils shall be reached by vote following opportunity for discussion and discernment, and a majority shall govern. This is about, that is about how we make decisions. Review and control. I've talked about our hierarchy. A higher council of the church shall have the right of review and control over a lower one, and shall have power to determine matters of controversy upon reference, complaint, or appeal. Now back to our leaders and how we get our leaders together. Presbyters, our ruling elders and teaching elders, and our deacons are ordained only by the authority of a council. Presbyters may be elected by the congregation, but the congregation does not ordain them. The session does. This one I think is very important for clerks because it's easy to slip up here. Ecclesiastical jurisdiction is a shared power to be exercised jointly by presbyters gathered in councils. We don't do this work alone. We don't run the church ourselves. As clerks, we are part of shared power as the church exercises its authority by presbyters gathered in councils. Finally, this is the last of these principles. Councils possess whatever administrative authority is necessary to give effects to duties and powers assigned by the Constitution of the Church. The jurisdiction of each council is limited by the express provisions of the Constitution, with powers not mentioned being reserved to the presbyteries. So when we do this work, we do it within the boundaries of our own understanding and of this Constitution. And when we make a decision, we can carry it out. So this kind of brings that section to a close. Do you have any questions about these? Or are these at all familiar to you? Is this new? Is this rehash? Are you falling asleep? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question along the way.
Not new.
Okay, good. Good.
Not new.
Very good. I'm glad. Now, so but this is a lot of stuff. There's a lot going on here. It's not easy to keep track of it all. The church depends on the clerk of session to help keep us in order and to give effect to this polity in the local congregation. So again, I want to turn to the Book of Order and look, what is the clerk of session in the Book of Order? What are the requirements of the clerk of session according to the Book of Order? So at G3.0104, we hear that the clerk of session shall record the transactions of the council, keep its rolls of membership and attendance, maintain any required registers, preserve its records, and furnish extracts from them when required by another council of the church. We're going to get into the details of most of these. My suspicion is that the first one is where most clerks spend most of their time, energy, and thinking. The second one is probably second on the list, and the second and third are together. And the fourth is something that you might do once or twice a year, or maybe even less frequently than that. And the fifth of these is, I hope, very rare for you, because hopefully you do not have to give records to others along the way. Usually when you do, it means something is up and it's not going well. So, but of course there is a lot more that clerks do, and there's a lot of shades to how this is done. So, and that's what the rest of our time together will be getting into. There are a few other places in the Book of Order that talk about the clerk of session. So a few other responsibilities that come related to the clerk. First of all, is that the clerk is, by definition, the secretary and creates the minutes of congregational meetings. The clerk also has some responsibilities for the renunciation of jurisdiction. I hope you never have to deal with the renunciation of jurisdiction question, but if you do, please give me a call. If you ever get to that point, I will help walk you through it. I have had to deal with it. We had someone renounce jurisdiction even in the short time I've been in the presbytery. So, and this was someone who, there are two kinds of renunciation of jurisdiction. One is somebody has come to understand that their faith and walk of faith is taking them in a different direction than the Presbyterian Church. Highly respectable, understanding, deep gratitude for the people's service and excitement about helping them find a new way. The other time renunciation of jurisdiction may come up is in a disciplinary matter, when someone is ready to be done with the church. They don't want to have to deal with the church's discipline. Those are a little less fun, I can tell you. So
would those be just individuals, or?
Yes, that is all an individual matter. So an individual sends a written statement of, I am renouncing my membership in the church. That's what that looks like. G3.0104, I've mentioned already. This is where we talk about the officers of councils. And it's about the basic responsibilities of clerks, the requirements of a clerk, and the election of a clerk. G3.0105 gets into your formal responsibilities in a meeting. If somebody says, I dissent from that matter, or I want to issue a protest, that's when somebody wants to add their name. I didn't vote for this. I want to be clear that I didn't sign on to this. Or I want to give you a written statement that is orderly, but says, here is why I protest this action. And lastly, the clerk has responsibilities around maintaining records that we'll talk some more about. Any questions on and we're going to get into some of these details, but before we go any further, any questions on these?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's look at some of the details here. The next one is about electing the clerk. Now, most of you have been through this. We sometimes have questions about this, so I do want to mention it. The clerk of session must be a ruling elder. You have to have been ordained at some point, and you are not necessarily currently installed as an active serving elder on session. Question actually came up recently. Do you even have to be a member of the church you are serving? And the question, and there's no clear answer on that. And I think that the answer could be no. We definitely have situations where the clerk of a presbytery is not a member of the presbytery. So I think there is good basis for if you get in a bind, sometimes you might have to elect a clerk who's a member of another church who's willing to serve. The next up is that the clerk is elected by the session. That's very important. And there needs to be a point in the minutes every time you elect the clerk. It says you've elected a clerk. Finally, the clerk is elected for such a term as the session may determine. I suspect most of our sessions do this on an annual basis, but the term could be longer if the session so chooses, or shorter for that matter. So that also gives permission to have a clerk who's a clerk pro tem. So if you're going to be out of town on vacation, taking that long-awaited European vacation for 3 months in Europe, the clerk can elect a temporary clerk. And the term of a clerk may be renewed. There are no term limits for the clerk of session in the Book of Order. Some churches might make one in the bylaws of the church, but that nothing is in the Book of Order about that. Any questions on electing the clerk? Yeah, go ahead.
You said that the clerk can find their own replacement if they're away.
Well, yes, but the session should be the ones to elect that person. It really should be somewhere in the minutes that even if it's at the minute, even if you're away for a meeting unexpectedly, they should say so-and-so was elected to serve as clerk pro tem for this meeting due to the absence of the clerk. So that should actually be in the minutes.
So just saying that such and such is acting as clerk today for such a meeting is not enough? I
think that's fine. Usually that'll be okay too. That's another way to say they were elected. usually it's what you would call from a parliamentary perspective, unanimous consent. I mean, if you have two people who want to fight it out about being clerk, that might be a good problem. So usually it's more the problem finding that happen. Yeah. Other questions on elections? Yeah.
We have in the past elected an assistant clerk. That way, when needed, that person is just already, has that moniker.
That's a great thing to do. I just encourage you to make sure that that somewhere you've delineated that person stands in for the clerk when the clerk is absent. Sometimes, there are other sessions that that divide up the tasks. So sometimes there might be the clerk of session and a recording clerk, and the recording clerk is responsible for creating the minutes, and the clerk is the one who signs off on everything in the end. When in New York City Presbytery, for some of the time that I was clerk of the presbytery, we had a recording clerk who was paid to take the minutes of the presbytery meetings. Now, so we've talked about how the clerk gets elected, but what does the clerk actually do? We get back to these 3 items. That the clerk keeps the records, supports meetings, and does reports. So the rest of the conversation is going to focus on these 3 items. So the first being keeping records. What does the clerk do about keeping records? The clerk prepares the minutes, maintains rolls and registers, preserves records. I'm having trouble saying that. Provides verification of actions, and receives and sends formal communications. So minutes, everybody's favorite topic in a clerk conversation. What is included in the minutes of session? Most importantly, and you can't leave it out, is a record of the actions taken. So your goal as the clerk is to record when an action is taken. If you have nothing else in there, you've got to have that. Now, if there is a written report that comes requesting an action, and it includes context or rationale, you might also want to include that in your minutes. You want to include details that help tell the story of the congregation. So we talked about adventure earlier this morning. Some people are going to look back on the minutes of the session to understand the history of the church. So anything you can do to give details that might help someone in the future reconstruct the story of the congregation in this moment, that will be helpful. Now, there are some things that you should not include in the minutes. That is the contents of discussion. This is not a court transcript. You do not need to list out everything that everybody says. And in fact, you should not list out everything that everybody says. You should also not list the names of speakers. You do need to name the makers of motions. I will also tell you, according to Robert's rules, this might start there are a couple things I will tell you that might start a fight. And this is one of them. You do not, according to Robert's rules, need to get the name of the person who makes a second to a motion. You should note the name of the maker of the motion, but you should not worry about finding out who seconded it. And
That's new.
it is, right? I
don't understand that, because if you don't have a second to the motion, then the motion can't be carried. So is it that we're not supposed to note the second, or just that we don't have to?
You should always note that a second was made, but you don't have to say who did it. So Sarah moved that the session approve ordination of the new elders. The motion was seconded. That would be an appropriate way to manage that. Now, there is a caveat to this conversation, which will completely blow your mind, that I'm not going to spend a lot, that you can, when your session is about 12 or less, you can skip a second entirely. According to Robert's rules. Now, if you go and tell your moderator that at your next session meeting, they're probably going to say, you're lying. Don't listen to that crazy man who told you all of this. So I don't suggest that you go and try to change, and everybody around the table is going to say the same thing. So I don't suggest that you go try to change your practice. But what I do hope you'll think about here is that a second just means that that's how you start discussion. So sometimes a motion will die for lack of a second. But once you start talking about it, you've basically seconded it. So don't stress over, all that to say, don't stress over who seconded the motion. Make a note that it happened and then move on. Because your minutes really need to tell the story of your congregation. And anything that's distracting from that story, that's told through the actions you took, it should not be in your minutes.
But if you're trying to tell a story, you have to mention, well, Sarah made a motion that we ordain elders. And then let's just say, then you say, someone noted that it's not a good idea to ordain elders. Well, whatever, just that you're
Yeah.
putting in, you're telling the story of what happened in the meeting. And then the resolution of it was that it was determined that installing the elders would take place on such a date, whatever.
Mhm.
But so telling the story includes some of the content of the discussion that is pertinent to what is being discussed. And I think if the whole point is to tell a story, if you go from once upon a time, there were 3 little bears and they died. But, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, what happened? So you don't mention that Sarah shot one, Dandy poisoned the other, and Laverne cooked the other one for lunch. But, so in that sense, you miss the whole point of the story. And it's not, I think that my minutes are pretty long because I include some of these discussions because it lends context to what is being said and shows that other points of view were heard, discussed, and taken into account. So it's not necessarily, as you say, to say who said what, but to give context.
Yes.
Because I think if you leave out some of that, it just doesn't make any sense, or it's just like, well, what?
I think you've raised it. That is always the challenge of good minutes, is to find that balance. Because I have seen minutes where it's difficult to determine what actually happened because there were so many extraneous things in there. So just make sure you're very clear on this is what happened. This is what we decided. If you're going to put the background there, great, but make sure you still understand this is what the session ended up doing in the end. Because I have seen and I've seen a meeting that went 2 hours take 30 pages of minutes or 15 pages of minutes. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I do a summary of pertinent discussion and say the motion was approved.
Yeah, a short paragraph can be really helpful, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe even 2 if you need it, but yeah.
Because after the motion is made, the first thing that the moderator asks, is there any discussion?
Yeah. Well, and sometimes in a lot of sessions, you'll talk about it before you even have a motion.
True.
And that's totally allowed too, especially in a small group.
Okay.
Okay.
So keep it short.
Keep it short, but make sure you're this is you're holding a lot of things in tension as clerk, and this is part of what you got to do is figure out, okay, what's the right amount of detail, and work with your session to find out how much they want in their minutes. So,
and another thing I do, Andy, is if somebody has a report that they hand out, or maybe they have if it's a business item, they have a proposal or something like that, then in my minutes, I say, I give a little bit of info about what this was about. And then I say, such and such report was given out and a copy is filed with these minutes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then I put it in the minute book so that whoever is looking back through the minute book will get a little bit more information beyond what's in the actual minutes themselves.
I
And
think-
so even when I do just a brief discussion, I like the fact that I bold what the action was. So, you know, it sort of jumps out at you without having to.
Mhm, mhm.
Mhm. I think that's a really good way to do it. Bold, italicize, find a way that works for you and your session so that it's clear for everybody. And somebody who's looking back at it 50 years from now, if you're doing it consistently, they'll understand. They'll figure out as after they look through after 2 or 3 meetings worth, they'll figure out what you mean. You don't even have to put a key for what you were doing.
I have a
few-
quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
Karen mentioned that if there's a report, she includes it with the minutes.
Mhm.
I tried to do that, but if what I put in the minutes is such and so administration ministry was previously circulated, action items were blah, 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 blah. So I refer to that there was a report, but I don't say what the report was or what was in the report. And I don't always include it with the minutes.
You
Should
don't
I
have
be doing
to.
that?
No, you do
No.
not have to.
I
It is
don't
a-
include it. I don't include it with the minutes either. I just put a note that says, copy of this report is filed with these minutes, so that when I put it in the big minute book, I have the set of minutes. Then I have, whatever this report or proposal or whatever it is in the book just behind those minutes, so that if somebody is looking at the minutes, they can see, oh, right, oh, there's something else. Turn the page, find the next thing. But I don't make it part of the minutes itself. Does that help you understand that?
You can also, it can be really helpful if you do a lot of that, you may actually want to be clear to label it and call it an attachment to the minutes. And
Yeah,
if
you
you've
could do
got
that.
4 committees, you may want to have attachment A, B, C, and D, and say in your minutes, the report is found at attachment A. If you want to get really fancy, that's probably the most appropriate way to do it. And there are some ways you can with your computer make those into a single file and all that kind of stuff we can talk about later. Some other stuff that you have to include in your minutes. So each set of minutes has to mention whether the meeting is special or regular. Is it a stated meeting or a called meeting? Those are the other terms we sometimes use for that. The name of the church, the place, date, and time of the meeting. If it's on Zoom, say that. The name of the moderator of the meeting. Because remember, your moderator has to be present. Your appointed moderator has to be present for a quorum to be there. You must say that the meeting is opened and closed with prayer every time. You have to list the role of people who are present, anybody who's excused, and if there's anybody else present, who they are. And why, and briefly why they may be there. So, staff members or, guests, observers. You have to affirm that you had a quorum present. Your church bylaws or manual of operations should set the size of a quorum. If it does not, it is a majority of the membership. So you definitely want to make sure that your bylaws say you're less than a majority, give a specific quorum for your congregation, because getting a quorum of the majority of the members of your congregation can be hard. It has to talk about how you approve the agenda, or you have to mention the approval of the agenda and the approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. You could list out the amendments there, but you may actually just want to make them. It's sometimes easier just to say the minutes were approved as presented, or the minutes were approved as amended. Sarah.
Just a question about approving the agenda. is it enough just to say the agenda was approved?
Yes, that's all you should say. You do not need to list out the agenda in the minutes. That becomes kind of ridiculous. Then you have the agenda, which actually then follows. So you can infer what the agenda is based on the minutes that follow. The minutes also need to include the clerk's report if there is one. We'll talk some more about what that looks like. And this kind of gets to some of the things we were just talking about. The reports of pastor, other staff, treasurer, and committee chairs should be summarized. So if you want to attach them, you could, but you can also just briefly summarize them. And sometimes the summary is the treasurer gave a report on church funds as of June 30th. You don't have to include the full report, as long as you have that in there once a year, for example. But yeah, you can just say that a report happened, because sometimes you need evidence that it did happen without any care of what was in it. Finally, the last couple of things, you have to include motions, any amendments if you had them, and whether they passed or failed. So even if a motion fails, be sure to put it in there. You know, a motion was made and seconded to buy Burger King for lunch after church on Sunday. After discussion, it failed. Just coming out of experience working with some churches, you should be very careful in your minutes about recording actions taken to hire, compensate, evaluate, discipline, or terminate your non-ordained staff. Not to say you shouldn't do the same for ordained staff, but you should be very clear about those related to non-ordained staff as well. Any more questions about what you should or should not put in your minutes? All right, so next up, we want to talk about keeping records and archives, because the clerk is ultimately responsible for preserving the records of the church. You should learn what to keep and what to throw away. There is a guide for what you should and should not keep, and it's a records retention schedule that's available from the Presbyterian Historical Society. I'll make sure you have a link to that in the resources folder that I'll share with you after today's meetings. In general, minutes you keep forever. Do not throw away minutes of session. You might be, we could debate about committees, but you must, session minutes are permanent documents. Financial records in general, beyond the annual, kind of an annual summary report that goes in your minutes, you want to keep those for 7 years. Keep all of your important papers in a secure place at the church. Do not keep them at home. We don't know, we don't know what might happen to any one of us. And if the stories about people who unfortunately had to step away unexpectedly as clerk, their family members discovered this box of papers that they didn't understand, and they just threw it out, and they managed to throw out the minutes of the church. So do not keep them in your home. Find a secure place to keep them at the church. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but think about ways you can do that. You might have to get a fireproof filing cabinet or something for the church. They're not cheap. They're a real pain to get once you get in the building, once you get one, but it's really, that might be something to think about. Older records outside of 5 to 10 years, can be placed in an archival facility. Columbia Seminary has an archival facility. Also, and that's very local. The Presbyterian Historical Society has an archival facility in Philadelphia. I will mention before Sarah, I see your question. I will mention for historically Black churches, the Presbyterian Historical Society has a special program where they will take your records on deposit and make an electronic copy of them for you at
I love it.
at a very limited cost. And they will do that for any church, but you pay a fee. They have a special program to do that for historically Black churches and to make those more available. So I encourage you to reach out to them. www.history.pcusa.org is how to get in touch with them. And they can tell you that they've got all kinds of resources there. They will take your records on deposit and they will help you get an electronic copy of them. So Sarah, I saw your hand.
A question about the minutes when the session is in executive meeting.
Okay.
They have to be recorded. They have to be signed by whoever is the moderator of that time. And they're supposed to be, well, we have to keep them. And if they're in the same binder or folder or whatever as the regular minutes, that sort of defeats the purpose of the whole executive session. So what does one do with those minutes?
So what I would encourage most sessions to do is not to keep separate minutes of executive sessions, because anything you do in executive session really has to be reported out at some point, because that you can't keep that from the presbytery. Just because it happened in executive session doesn't mean that the presbytery doesn't know about it. So very much would say, what I would say is the best practice is in your regular minutes, say the session moved into executive session upon motion and second, or something like that. At the conclusion of the executive session, the following action was reported out of the executive session. And sometimes executive session is, most of the time, it's about keeping confidential the discussion and holding a particular matter in confidence for a short term. So you're taking an action today, and in 2 weeks, it's going to be public. So that would be, that to me, usually at a certain point in time, there's no need for the executive session to be secret anymore, because you've got to take some action out of it. Yeah, Sarah.
So, if we're discussing, for example, salary remuneration, and our regular moderator says we're going into executive session and has asked somebody else to be the moderator for the session during that period, does that not have to be documented?
You
to
should
say, as part of the meeting, the session went into executive meeting, I guess with moderator such and so. So you don't have to say that, okay.
You absolutely don't want, you want to document that it happened. And then when it's done, when you come out of the executive session, you should document in the main minutes what happened in executive session. Not the discussion, but because any of the, like, if you took an action related to compensation, it's got to be public at some point. It doesn't remain private. Because it's got to be acted upon. It's just a matter of, yeah.
Doesn't the moderator of that executive session have to sign those minutes?
So
the portion over which the moderator was in charge at that time?
No. I will also note the signature question. According to the latest version of Robert's rules, The only signature you need on the minutes is the signature of the clerk, not of the moderator. I'm blowing your minds today.
What?
Right. So you only need, doesn't that make your life easier? I hope.
It does.
Is that true of the congregational meeting minutes?
Yes. That is the one place that has been different historically, but as I understand it now, it is not necessary for the moderator to sign. I'm not sure that our checklist is updated in that regard. So we're going to have to do, so pay attention to the checklist. Trust your checklist more than you trust me on this at the moment. But in time, I'm hoping we will be able to clarify, we don't need the moderator's signature. We just need the clerk's signature. Because that's what Robert's rules says we need, is the secretary of the meeting.
But we have it recorded. Andy said we don't have.
We
to
have this
the
recording.
signature.
Yes, we do. Yes.
And we
So
have to-
we will get
you-
the, I'm going to work on getting that checklist updated. It may not be updated for this year, for 2022 reviews in early 2023, but it will be updated for 2024 for sure. So so just a couple of thoughts on electronic records. I know some folks are starting to think about this. Just having a digital copy of your minutes is not enough. You need a paper copy of the final approved minutes. That's the one you sign. If you get into this and start playing around with it, there's a format called PDF-A. The A stands for archival. That is the format you should use for the final version. Don't just keep one electronic copy. Make sure you have multiples. You never know who's going to decide, oh, I don't need any of this, and then erase 5 years of session minutes because they didn't know what they were doing. I know in my previous presbytery, we had a COM chair who erased the entire COM folder in Dropbox because he needed more space in his Dropbox account. So yes,
Question.
yeah.
We just discovered that the Zoom meetings that we thought were recorded, the session meetings were recorded.
Mhm.
I went to go and look for something from, what was it, August, July, only to discover that they weren't there anymore. Where are you talking about keeping these electronic copies?
Well,
how
so
do
I
get-
would say, so a recording of a meeting is not the minutes of the meeting.
Know
I'm
that.
talking, yeah. So if you keep electronic copies, I'm talking about keeping in OneDrive, SharePoint, Dropbox, some sort of cloud service that's out there. Or you also should keep a local copy, like on a thumb drive or on your personal computer. But don't just keep one. If you use a cloud, control the access to it. Most of the time you can say, only the clerk has the ability to write. Anybody else can view it, but they can't change it. That's what that last point is about. If you need some help with
Okay,
electronic questions, let me know. Yeah, go ahead.
I
Sarah.
will. I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, please do. I'm happy to. And I will also say that that's a really good point. Just because you have a recording of the meeting, that recording in the courts of the church, I will tell you, a recording of the meeting does not stand for anything over minutes. The approved minutes of a meeting are the final authority on what happened at that meeting. So my practice has been that once the minutes are approved, and I wouldn't do this with the presbytery because we do some other things, but if we were, once the minutes of a meeting are approved, the electronic recording, a recording of it really is irrelevant for the purposes of understanding what happened from a business perspective. So if you've got limited space, delete it. Now, most of you probably also do some work to support meetings. You distribute the materials. We've talked at length about minutes. We've got the clerk's report. And you tend to be involved in preparing the agenda. And some of the most important work that the clerk can do is to help keep routine tasks before your session that happen over the course of the year. So we're going to talk about those in a minute. Let's see here. I'm going to skip a slide or two. So the clerk's report. So these are some of the different kinds of reports. The clerk's report, an annual calendar or planning about commissioners to presbytery gatherings, doing the annual review, and your annual statistical report. I'm going to try to move through these quickly because I know most folks are probably ready to be done at 12, but I want to finish a few more thoughts here. The clerk's report is a monthly review of items that just need to get in the minutes. In the presbytery, we call this the admit to record. Sometimes that's a term that's common around here. Sometimes these get reported elsewhere, but use the clerk's report just to make sure they get in the minutes. So, so session action is usually required before something takes place, and then you have to report that it actually happened. So you actually see a lot of things in the minutes twice. First, you'll see them approved, and then later you see them recorded as complete. For example, most common example is you see the approval of a baptism and then the record that it happened. So the session approved the sacrament of baptism to happen on this Sunday. Then the sacrament of baptism happened on this Sunday. So that leads us in.
Do you have to have a specific date for approving baptism?
You don't have to, no. You could, I mean, it's best practice to, but you could leave it out. You could say it was approved on a Sunday to be determined in consultation with the pastor or something like that. So these are the things that you might show that would show up in the clerk's report. The baptism's approved and then the baptism celebrated. Lord's Supper approved. I encourage you, do the Lord's Supper once a year. So figure out what your schedule is going to be, do it once. Along with that, you can add permission for the pastor to celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's Supper when it's pastorally sensitive and theologically appropriate. So that way you don't have to get special permission when the pastor goes to visit the homebound and takes communion. And then it just gets reported that it happened. And these are some of the language of how to do that. Weddings need to be approved. I don't think they necessarily have to be recorded that they happened. They're not sacraments. They just have to be approved.
If our pastor performs a wedding in a different place other than the church, do we have to give him approval?
You do not have to approve the pastor doing it. You should record that the pastor did it. If you approving a wedding is about approving the church space for a wedding, because it is not about approving the wedding itself, because that's up to the pastor. The ministers have discretion about weddings, but the session has a discretion about the use of the church space.
Thank you.
For you want to include the names of new members. Sometimes this happens elsewhere, but it's really helpful for the clerk to make sure that this happens. Transfer requests, removing members from the roll. You want to record births in the family of the congregation. You want to record deaths. If you don't like to say that so-and-so died, you could say that so-and-so, the session, with sorrow, the session noted that that John Doe was transferred to the membership of the Church Triumphant on a certain date. So, find the language that works for you. This is the clerk's report also is helpful to note the ordination and or installation of ruling elders and deacons. I'll have a handout in the materials that I will give you that gives some idea. It gives you kind of a template for a clerk's report for each meeting. It's also important to have a annual checklist to list and outline this. And this is really only for the clerk. Sometimes you'll work with your moderator on this, but make sure that you get certain things done at different periodic intervals. Things you do every month, things you do every quarter, things you do every January. This is something that you customize for the needs of your church and your internal practices. I've got some examples of this coming up, and build this off of your session minute review form. So this is a sample annual checklist. Every month, you want to make sure you report things that have happened, you approve the minutes, et cetera, et cetera. January, work on the statistical report for General Assembly. Approve the budget for the year. Elect commissioners for presbytery meetings. Approve sacraments, celebrations. Call the congregational meeting. And your congregational meeting may not happen in January, so you want to move that checklist item to the correct month. In February, that is the time that the annual statistical report is due, so that will always be then. So just pay attention to that. When you do confirmation, you want to make sure you do that. So you figure out how all of these different checklist items link in with your church's calendar. So it's also your responsibility to help make sure we get commissioners for presbytery meetings. You usually do this in consultation with your moderator. Here are the dates for 2023: February 11th, May 2nd, August 15th, and November 4th. And the formats for those. Again, these are on the handout. I have a handout of this whole presentation that I'll make sure you get. We send out the meeting materials 2 weeks before the meeting. If it's an in-person meeting, we ask for pre-registration for an in-person meeting so we can plan for the number of people. If you're coming to our meeting on November 12th, please pre-register by Monday. If you're coming to a Zoom meeting, there's still registration required. Usually, I think, by about 2 days before that meeting. The annual review of minutes, that will be coming up in the beginning of the year. I have not figured out how we're going to do it yet. We're trying to figure out if that's going to happen on Zoom or in person. This is actually fulfilling a book of order requirement. It's called General Administrative Review. The goal of this is to make sure that the minutes are correctly recorded, that what the session did is it was done in accordance with the Constitution of the Church, that the actions were prudent and equitable and faithful to the mission of the whole church. That's what we're checking for. And that's what's on that checklist that you are familiar with. Here is the current version of Greater Atlanta's checklist.
Yeah.
You've probably seen this before. The annual statistical report, you've probably done this before as well. This is, you submit to the Presbytery and the National Church through a web portal. You'll get the access information for this around the 1st of January. If you need it before then, just drop me an email. I can get it for you. The submission deadline is mid-February. If it would be helpful there are some changes to that report that are going to take place for 2023. So I may try to get some of that information out earlier. We're moving away, for example, from just reporting female members. We're actually now reporting male, female, and other, and then non-binary, etc. Understandings of gender. That's one of the big changes. And there's a bunch of changes to the financial reports section as well. So just be aware that that's happening. Very quickly about Zoom meetings, just some quick notes. This is a cartoon that dates well before the pandemic. Since somebody's sending their laptop now, we're all in these boxes. Just some very quick notes about electronic meetings. First of all, technically a Zoom meeting must be specifically authorized in the bylaws or your manual of operations. That's going to, there's an amendment to the Book of Order that will clarify this a little bit, but I would encourage you to make sure that your bylaws and manual of operations talk about about having an electronic meeting. The language that your bylaws should use is simultaneous oral communication. That is what is required. You don't have to see people's faces, but you have to be able to hear each other in voice in real time. An electronic meeting cannot happen via YouTube because that's one way. You've got to be able to have, you can stream your meetings via YouTube. That's what we're doing for the Presbyterian meeting next month, but it is not an electronic meeting. It is a fully in-person meeting. One thing to note, electronic access to meetings is not required by Robert's Rules of Order or by the Book of Order. So you do not have to offer electronic access. If you choose to require electronic options in your rules, be very careful about it, but that you don't want to require it, because if one person has technical difficulty getting connected, you could render the entire meeting invalid. So just be very careful that you want to offer an electronic option rather than require an electronic option. Or you could require offering an electronic option, but just be very careful about that language. One final piece here is that email votes, I get this question occasionally, email votes do not count. You can, it's a poll, but it is not final and official. You must take an action at the next meeting to ratify it so that it shows up in the minutes as a done thing. Sarah.
So doing an email vote, and then at the next session meeting saying there was an email vote to approve such and such, is it approved?
Yes, that at that point, that would be the appropriate way to do it. Okay. My recommendation is send it out via email. Always put a deadline on it. And ask people to respond and tell them don't reply all, reply back to the clerk. And they note their action. The moment anybody expresses concern or wants to talk about it, or if they vote no, then you stop. Because it's once you take an action, you can't undo it. Once you do something, then that's when you call a meeting to, and with Zoom now, you should be able to call a meeting to do what you need to do. But I would strongly, I strongly encourage people, if you have to do something like via email poll like that, one no vote stops it until you can talk about it at an actual meeting, electronic or in person.
Does that mean if one person does not respond and you already have a majority?
You could make that decision. It's not about the majority at this point. It's about making sure that you are all on board with it, because you can't undo it. So it's, think about if you're deciding to spend $5,000 to repaint the sanctuary and you've decided to go forward with it and somebody objects to it, you can't ask the painter to come scrape the paint off the walls and give you your check for $5,000 back. You've already done it. So just be very judicious about using those, because they're not final.
Well, I wasn't thinking anything quite so drastic, but the Christian Education Ministry want to have a trunk or treat on such a date. Do you agree or disagree? And then they respond, yeah, that's fine. And then if somebody doesn't respond and 8 of the 9 people have already said yes, to me, that's approved. And then at the next session meeting,
Mhm.
you bring that up, that said, put it on the agenda to confirm the approval of.
Right. Yeah. And that's,
Okay.
you're doing it right. And I think yeah, do it thoughtfully and use it judiciously. Don't do it for, if you've got 4 email votes on every session meeting agenda, then maybe you're doing too many email votes. But some people, that's just how they work. So just, do it thoughtfully, be judicious about it. That's all I have to say. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, Callie.
If I do a poll, normally I am going to talk. If I do an email poll, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to either ask them to call me or I call them,
Mm-hmm.
because then I know I'm talking to the right person,
I
or
think
I'm getting a response from the right person.
that's smart too. Yeah, especially if you know your people and they share email addresses around their household.
Well, I do it a little differently. You were saying to have them respond to the clerk, not respond all. And I have asked them to respond all,
Okay.
so that, if first to see that everybody is agreeing, so they can see that, who else responded. And also if they disagree, then that also would be noted. And if it's something significant, we can stop it.
Yeah.
But the email votes are usually minor things, not anything of significant.
Yeah. I think yeah. You figure out what we're as in all things, figure out what works for your church and your session. And it may, it may change over time. But one of the things the clerk can do is help give some consistency to it. Just a quick word about the manual of operations of the church. This is a requirement of the Book of Order. And that specify, the manual of operations specifies the form and guides the work of mission in that council session. A lot of stuff that used to be in the Book of Order is not there anymore. And so the manual of operations is a good way to collect that information. It's a collection of policies, procedures, and best practices that fit your session and your congregation. The image that I have expressed that I think helps people understand this well, this is a collection of your policies for your church so that anybody could figure out how you do things. Think about it as a loose leaf binder. You can take things out, replace them, edit them very easily. There are some resources about preparing a manual of operations that'll be in the folder that I share with you. So, any final questions? Well, I thank you for your service, first of all, but also for your engagement around all of this today. You've asked wonderful questions. You've helped me think better about this work and understand how you do it in this presbytery. And my next presentation will be better because of your questions and the helpful things you're asking. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, if I can be of help with you, with your work as a clerk. That is why I am here, is to support you in this ministry, because it's ministry, ultimately. This is such an important part of what it means to be Presbyterian, and we need to walk together as we do it.